And now our third and final woman of silence. It was about 40 years ago. I stopped by a small Catholic bookstore on Cape Cod to buy a bunch of pro-life lapel pins, for the members of our parish's newly formed Celebrate Life Committee that I had been roped into being chairman of. As I paid for them, the sales clerk and I got into a little bit of a conversation about pro-life ministry in general, and I happened to mention that our newly formed group was trying to decide on a patron saint. And he laughed, and he reached behind him, and he took a small reliquary off a shelf, and he handed it to me. He said, "Here, you can borrow this for a few weeks. I lend it out to those who tend to need this saintly woman's help." He said, "It's a first-class relic of Blessed Margaret of Castello," whom I'd never heard of. He said, "And believe me, she's the perfect pro-life patron. If you and your group pray and ask for her intercession, she'll lead you to wondrous things." And then he handed me a small book, this one here, which some of you have read, I'm sure, written by the Dominican priest William Bonnewell, that told the story of this remarkable woman. Well, I bought the book, and I brought the relic home. I read the book that evening, and I took both book and relic to our next Celebrate Life Committee, placed it there on the table. And then I briefly described Blessed Margaret's life to the 30 members of our little ministry there. As I recall, that was only the second meeting of our ministry. We were still in the process of kind of getting organized, And just then our pastor stopped by the meeting room and asked if we would pray for a young unmarried woman who was about to abort her baby. A parishioner had asked him to speak with this young woman, which he did, but she was adamant. She was between jobs, couldn't afford a child, being pregnant. She'd have trouble finding a new job. On and on she went with him. He managed to convince her to wait at least a week. And then he came into us, and he hoped that our prayers would change things, and he left us. It was rather remarkable. And so everyone in the room turned to the little reliquary on the table and looked at it. And so we prayed the rosary together, and then prayed in the Spirit for another 10 or 15 minutes, asking Blessed Margaret to intercede for us. And at that point, one of our members simply said, "I think this Margaret just said something to me." Well, I thought that was pretty interesting. So I said, "Oh, what did she tell you?" "She said we must support this child and pay for everything." Dead silence. No one says a word. But that's exactly what we did. And the woman agreed to have her baby. For the next year, we conducted bake sales, raffles, had a couple of concerts. We begged for personal contributions, anything to raise money. Our pastor provided funds when we needed them. The young woman had her baby. She got a new higher-paying job, was soon able to support her little daughter on her own. And by the way, with no input from us, she named the child Margaret. That was my introduction to this woman. I have a little statue of her. I meant to bring it, put it up here, and I just forgot. It's kind of neat. I'll bring it in sometime. Anyway. So, let me tell you about this remarkable woman, this Blessed Margaret of Castello. She was born in the year 1287. In the midst of all the turbulence and savagery that plagued the Italian city-states at the time, She was born in the castle of a wealthy and noble family that lived not far from Florence. And given the circumstances of her birth, one would expect that she would enjoy a pretty happy life, but that didn't happen. You see, little Margaret was her parents' only child, and she suffered from more than a few problems. First of all, she was their only child and she was a girl, not the hoped-for son to carry on the family noble line. But friends, that was just the beginning. She suffered from dwarfism, a little person, we'd say today. She was a hunchback. One of her legs was several inches shorter than the other, so she limped. By any human standard, she was ugly. And to top it all off, Margaret was born blind. To her parents, she was a monster, a freak, a less than human embarrassment that must be hidden. And hide her they did. Had it not been for the parish priest, she would have been nameless, not even baptized, but he insisted and they allowed it, letting one of the servants name her Margaret. At first, her parents hid her away in the shadows and dark places of the castle. But as she grew into girlhood, hiding her from others became more of a challenge. But because she was a devout, prayerful little girl, even at the age of 6, her father decided to build a small chapel, more like a cell, attached to the parish church. And there she would live alone and sealed off from the world. Sealed off because her father had a mason seal off the doorway to her cell with bricks. Had a little opening where she could observe Mass, receive communion, and receive food. For 12 years she lived in that cell, accompanied only by God's grace showered on her through the sacraments, through Eucharist and penance. Eventually, her parents decided to take her to another city, Città di Castello, where miraculous healings had been reported at a Franciscan shrine there. Their hopes, of course, were shattered when Margaret remained Margaret. Still deformed, still blind, still no longer a child, now a young woman. Margaret saw her life very differently than her parents did. To Margaret, everything in her life was a gift. Everything had a purpose. Everything was good. Of course, her parents disagreed, and so they did what one might expect of this couple. They simply abandoned her in this new city and returned home without her. Out of necessity, she became a beggar, but one whose holiness attracted attention. Good people would take her into their homes, and eventually an order of cloistered nuns received her into their convent. Margaret was overjoyed and followed the order's rule to the letter. Sadly, though, the nuns had long since ignored the rule, and Margaret's holiness, her quiet devotion, only drew attention to their own lack of piety. And you guessed it, they tossed her out. And once again, she found herself on the streets. But it was on these streets that she met members of the Order of Penance of St. Dominic, Third Order Dominicans. All women, they wore a habit, and they followed a religious rule, but they didn't live in community. They lived in their own homes. Most were widows, a few were married, and Margaret wanted so much to join them. But that was not allowed because she was not a widow or married. But eventually, after much discussion, it was decided to admit her, and they made an exception. She became the first young, unmarried woman of the order. She was probably about 20 at the time. The city's wealthy families would take her in, but she insisted on living in small attic rooms so she could follow the rule of her order. Soon enough, others began to notice the presence of the miraculous in this young woman's life. Although blind and illiterate, she could recite all 150 Psalms from memory. The same was true of her daily office. She didn't have to read it. She couldn't read it anyway. She knew it all by memory. She used to tutor the sons of the young wealthy families she lived with, asking them to recite their lessons they had learned from school that day. And the subjects would include logic, mathematics, music, astronomy, Latin. But if a boy made a mistake on any subject, she would immediately correct him. All of this from a blind, illiterate, uneducated young woman. When asked, Margaret would say only that such knowledge suddenly came to her. At Mass, from the moment of consecration through communion, she said she saw the Lord Jesus Christ in all his glory. Indeed, the glorified person, the glorified Jesus, was the only person she had ever seen. Margaret became heavily involved in the darker, hidden side of the city's life. Although few were as poor as she was, or suffered more, she spent her days and nights ministering to the poor, the sick, the dying, the imprisoned. Indeed, it was in the city's prisons that Margaret did her greatest work, did God's greatest work. These were foul places then. No sanitary facilities at all. Disease was common, and given the conditions, it was highly contagious and often led to death. Prisoners constantly chained lacked clothing, bedding, even food enough to ensure survival. And Margaret and her companions would arrive daily carrying bundles of bedding and food and clothing. But Margaret's presence brought something else, something more valuable. She restored in them, the prisoners, an awareness of their dignity as human beings, as children of God. Conversions were common, and the prisoners came to love her. And through Margaret's intercessions, healings took place, lives were changed. This woman's short life was a life of love. She loved all. Wherever she went, she led others to experience and share God's love. I suppose we could call her an evangelist of love, but an equal opportunity evangelist. She ministered to beggars and prisoners. She ministered to wealthy merchants and noblemen and women. She ministered to priests and nuns, leading everyone she met to holiness. And she did all this, not so much through her words, but through the love she extended to everyone she encountered. You see, Margaret was a living echo of that prophecy of Isaiah, where he describes the crucified Jesus, the suffering servant. Without beauty, without majesty, we saw him. He was spurned and avoided by men, a man of suffering, knowing pain, like one from whom you turn your face. Spurned, and we held him in no esteem. Yes, people turned their face from Margaret when they first met her. Everything is a gift, brothers and sisters. Everything is good. Even the suffering we experience, because it comes from God, because it all leads us to God's eternal, infinite love. Margaret died on April 13th, 1320, at the age of 33, the age we traditionally assign to Jesus at his death. April 13th then is her feast day, and this year it falls on the day after Easter Sunday, on Easter Monday. It will also be the 700th anniversary of her death. Although Margaret's brief life was filled with the miraculous, perhaps the greatest miracle took place shortly after her death. A huge crowd had surrounded her body as it was being carried to the church when a couple approached with their young daughter, who was both mute and unable to walk, a cripple. When the pallbearers lowered Margaret's body to the ground, the couple gently placed their afflicted daughter next to Margaret. The girl's mother and father began to pray aloud. People joined them. They prayed to Margaret, asking her to intercede for the daughter, who, like Margaret, was born with so many severe handicaps. And at this point, Margaret's left arm rose and touched the young girl. Hundreds of witnesses to this. A moment later, she who had never walked rose and walked. She who had never spoken said aloud, I have been cured. I have been cured through Margaret's prayers. It was almost 300 years before Margaret was beatified in 1609 by Pope Paul V. Her cause is still open. More than 200 miracles have been attributed to her since her death, and many of us continue to pray for her canonization. I mean, after all, can you consider a better saint for today? A young woman who today would probably have been aborted. A woman who, like our Lord, suffered much but loved even more. What an example to all of us, especially to those like me who complain so much about the little irritants of life, who, like me, have never really suffered. Today we encountered 3 women, 2 of them nameless, although the other might as well have been. And yet all 3 responded to God's call, offering us models of faith, hope, and love. The best way to lead others to faith is to share your own faith by living it. And an unlived faith, brothers and sisters, is a dead faith. And it's so easy to become like Simon the Pharisee, isn't it, and avoid those who have drifted away from God. Those who believe they have no hope because they've never heard God's saving word or tasted the cure of his forgiveness. Instead, we are called to be like Blessed Margaret. Although living in darkness, she shined a beam of light, a promise of salvation on all those trapped in the darkness of sinfulness and despair. Let us too become evangelists of love. As we begin these 40 days of Lent, I ask each of you to include Blessed Margaret among those we ask to intercede for our world today. A world so filled with hatred, so consumed by death, it has forgotten how to live, it has forgotten how to love. This Lent, let's leave behind any bitterness, all those little complaints that lead us to become less God-focused and more me-focused. Before our concluding prayer, let's all take a minute to reflect on what we hope to change this Lent, on all that we need to leave behind.